Um, we talked about the fact that the Old Testament times, the book of Psalms was used as a worship hymnal. They sang the songs in worship to God. And of course, we looked at several songs that are in our psalm book. We too still sing a number of the psalms, and they're very appropriate for psalms. In fact, I'd remind you, what does Paul say in Colossians 3:16? That we're to sing to one another in the very first thing is psalms, hymns, and spiritual songs. So singing psalms to each other is a very, very positive thing. Um, Lyric poetry, which is what the Psalms are written in, is so powerful. Poetry itself is, but particularly as it goes to the Psalms, poetry has the power of imagination. It relies on emotional impact to convey ideas rather than simply recounting the story. It uses exalted diction and ideas and noble expressions. And let me remind you, and I will say this a number of times throughout our study, that a major difference in ancient Hebrew poetry, which the book of Psalms is, and English poetry for the most part, is that the poetry of the Hebrews has rhythm of thought rather than the beat of syllables or rhyming scheme, as you know, in the psalm book, right? Every second or third line, there are rhyming words. That's not the way Hebrew poetry is. It is the rhythm and thought of lost myself. Oh, the rhythm of has rhythm of thought rather than rhyming of words. Okay, so in the Old Testament, I told you that there's some really good stuff here about the Old Testament. In our study of the Old Testament, we generally focus on the content, what's there, but we don't talk about the style the content was written. Because in fact, much, if not most, and that's a question that maybe scholars would differ on a little bit, but much of the Old Testament was written in poetic style rather than story form. Much of it is written in poetry, not just the book of Psalms. And that's not surprising because that's in line with what we know of the writings of ancient civilizations. Lyrical poetry is the earliest example of all literature that we have in existence, going back as far as we can. It was seen in early Egyptian and Babylonian cultures, which surrounded the Jews there in Palestine. In ancient Greeks, the poets sang their songs long before the philosophers and historians told the stories. So let me give you a little example of that. One of the earliest songs or poems that we have in Genesis is found in Genesis 4:23 to 30 to 24. And scholars consider this to be not just a poem, but also a song. Lamech said to his wives, Ada and Zillah, listen to my voice. You wives of Lamech, give heed to my speech. For I have killed a man for wounding me and a boy for striking me. If Cain is avenged sevenfold, then Lamech 77-fold. And so, very early in the book of Genesis, we have this poem. Now, not all Hebrew poetry is written in the same style. There are two categories in the Old Testament. But the largest category is what we're going to understand as lyric poetry, which the book of Psalms is written in. But there's also wisdom poetry. Now, these are works of thought and reflection, observations of the human condition. Think about Old Testament books for a moment. What books in the Old Testament would you think would fall under this classification of wisdom poetry? Any ideas? The wisdom. When you think of Proverbs, Don says, Proverbs. Proverbs is, Job is considered wisdom poetry. And as you read through Job, you can see that you can really sense the poetry that is in that book. Ecclesiastes, right? The wisdom of who? What's Ecclesiastes is the wisdom of who? Solomon, the smartest man who ever lived, right? God gave him that. And so these are considered wisdom poetry, but as I said, the greatest amount is called lyric poetry. Makes up the vast amount of poetry, including the Psalms. Now, scholars didn't really understand this until the late 1700s, the 18th century. There was a bishop named Robert Loth who wrote a book, The Treatise on Hebrew Poetry, and he discovered things that helped scholars more accurately understand the Old Testament writings, including that so much of it was in poetry. This is interesting. You know, I probably said that 3 times now. Interesting. It's interesting to me. I hope it's interesting to you. But the King James Version, what year was that written in? Or not written in, but translated. Anybody remember? Yeah, 1611. Okay? So that was a good 150 years before this man, Loth, did all of his research and found out that so much of the Old Testament is written in poetry. And so if you read, look, if you want to follow in your Bibles, I'm in Genesis now, Genesis 9, 25 and 26. In the King James, you're just going to see this written back and forth across the page, just like it's regular a story, right? But the New American Standard Bible, which was translated in the 1900s, right, 150 years after Loth did his research, almost every time you see almost everything in the book of Psalms is written like this. And when I want to copy things into my sermon, when I want to copy Scripture, and I'm in the book of Psalms, it takes a long time because I don't want to take up so much space on the page. So I'll fix it where it's long again. But can you see how it's written here in poetic form? Same passages, but that were translated about 400 years apart after it was understood that so much of the Old Testament was written in poetry. Another example is found in Genesis 24:60. Again, this is about the family of Rebekah speaking about her. And they blessed Rebekah and said unto her, Thou art our sister, be thou the mother of thousands of millions, let thy seed possess the gate of those which hate them. Now this is when the servant of Abraham has gone over to the home of Laban, Rebekah's brother, and found a wife for Isaac. And he's taking her back to Abraham and Sarah. And so, again, in the King James Version, it's just written as though it were story. But again, in the New American Standard, it's not. It's written as a poem because it is a poem. It's lyric poetry. Okay, so lyric is a term used to describe poetry that's meant to be sung. And so most of the book of Psalms would fall under that category. Let me just give you some examples of lyric poetry in the Old Testament. The Psalms, praises, we've already talked about. We'll get into a lot more detail. Lamentations is considered lyric poetry. Lamentations is the mourning of Jeremiah, right? Because of the sins of the people of Judah. God is going to send them into Babylonian captivity, and Jeremiah writes Lamentations because he's mourning over that. But even in the mourning, there is the promise and the hope that God will one day return His people. The steadfast love of the Lord never ceases. His mercies never come to an end. We think that's probably in Psalms, but it's not. It's in the book of Lamentations. The steadfast love of the Lord. Okay, so Lamentations, mournings. Okay, there are other places that we find blessings and cursings, forewarnings of things to come, We see this in Genesis 9, 25 and 26, in Noah, and God speaking to Noah. Again, Laban and his family blessing Rebekah. And the song of, or the statement of Moses in Deuteronomy 33, when he's warning the people, and we're not going to take time to read it, when he's warning the people that if they don't keep the law, this is the second time, remember, in Deuteronomy that God has given them the law through Moses. He gave them the law at Sinai, and now before Moses dies, Moses is going to give them the law again, and when he gets through, he is going to give them this warning, and it's found again in Deuteronomy 33, 1 through 29, and it is in lyric form. There are tribal songs. Again, the song of Lamech that we read earlier would be considered that. There are lyric poetry that are called mashals. These are lessons or parables. The example that Brother Maslanga gives is Samson's riddle in Judges 14:14. The riddle he gave to the men, and of course, his wife told him the answer, and things fell apart quickly. But that is in the form of a mashal, a lesson or parable. Another category is paeans, which refer to some historical event. A great example of that is the Song of Moses. We talked about that last week. I think Daniel brought that up. In Exodus chapter 15, 1 through 18, when the people have crossed the Red Sea, right? And they're safe now, and God has closed the sea over the Egyptians, and they're all drowning. Immediately after that, we have this Song of Moses. There in Exodus 15, 1 through 18. Again, it is a type of lyric poetry. And then we have dirges, funeral songs throughout the Old Testament. A good example of this is in 2 Samuel chapter 1, verses 17 through 27. And one of the reasons that I told you about going back, and you can find a lot of this lesson on BibleTalk.tv, because all the scriptures will be in there. So I know I'm talking quickly, and you probably don't have time to write all these down, but if you want to go back and look at these. 2 Samuel 1, 17 through 27 is the Song of David when he finds out, when he's told that Saul and Jonathan, his best friend, have died, right? God's anointed, and the friend that he loved more than anyone else have died. And so we have this song. It's a funeral song, essentially, of David. So within almost every one of the Old Testament books, you can find some form of this lyrical poetry. And so it just kind of gives us a different, I think maybe a little different perception of what the Old Testament is about, and what everything that's found there. All right, so now let's talk about just the characteristics of this lyric poetry. First of all, rhythm, and I've already spoken to this. No, okay. Most scholars agree there is a rhythm to Hebrew poetry, but not the type found in our Western poetry. It doesn't follow the number of syllables, or rather the pattern of ideas. I think that's a little bit of abstract for us to understand, because when we're reading like a song in a psalm book, we can see how the syllables work together and the rhyming words to make this poetry. But again, in Hebrew poetry, it's the rhyming of ideas, or the pattern of ideas, rather. There is no planned rhyme scheme in Hebrew poetry. When there is rhyme, it occurs because of coincidence, not because the author is intending for it to do that. So that makes it very different. Okay, here there are a number of devices. I'm actually moving through this a lot quicker than I thought, so that's good. There are a number of devices that we find in Hebrew poetry, and I know you won't remember the words, these technical words, but I think it does help us to understand as we begin studying the Psalms how these devices work. The first one, we saw a moment ago, is called assonance. I guess I'm pronouncing that right. And it's similar sounding words with different meanings. Now, it's not about rhyming, it's about that the words themselves are very, very similar. Um, in Jeremiah chapter 1, verses 11 and 12, we find two words. The first one is, I don't pronounce Hebrew very good, y'all. I'm going to say that's shakud, which is almond. The second word is shakud. Can you see a similarity there? Shakud and shakud. It's not that they rhyme, but the words are almost identical. And there's a reason for that. We won't see that when we read this verse, and I'm going to put it up on the board here. We're not going to see that in the English. But the Hebrew reader would notice these words are almost identical. They're very different in English, but very similar in Hebrew. The word of the Lord came to me, saying, "What do you see, Jeremiah?" And I said, "I see a rod of an almond tree." Then the Lord said to me, "You have seen well, for I'm watching over my word to perform it." Now again, this is a type of Hebrew poetry. The idea here is, again, we'd have to look into the background and culture as English or as Western readers. But the idea here is the almond tree. I don't know that much about almond trees. Anybody ever seen an almond tree? Well, guess what? They grow in the Holy Land in Palestine a lot. Almonds were a main part of their diet. And they're kind of a strange looking tree too, the way they grow. But anyway, the almond tree is the first tree to bud in the spring. I didn't know that, right? You do a little digging and you find out, okay, so what does that have to do with the other word, watching? Well, here's where they connect. In the same way, God is always first to see how people will react to Him. So this similarity is highlighted by the device of assonance, where the two key words, almond and watching, sound alike. And so when God asks him, "What do you see?" he says, "I see a rod of almond tree." The Lord said, "You've seen well, for I'm watching." God always knows first, doesn't He? We think we can hide things from people. In fact, we can, unfortunately, maybe to our detriment, get away with hiding things from people, but it's almost always found out. But who always knows first? God always knows first, and that's what the idea here is. And so again, this is just a device used by the writer to make a very strong point. And a Hebrew, or someone reading the Hebrew Old Testament, would see those two words as being almost identical. And there are others too that we could look at. But let me just leave that for right now. There are also acrostics. And if I'm not mistaken, I didn't go back and look at all the information about this, but Psalm 119 is a very big acrostic because each section of that begins with a letter of the Greek alphabet. But here's another example, Psalm 25. Now, we could go and look in our English Bible, but we're not going to see, we won't know those Hebrew words, right? But in fact, in Psalm 25, the 22 verses form an acrostic, each where every verse begins with a successive letter in the Hebrew alphabet. In other words, there are 22 letters in the Hebrew alphabet, and each verse begins with a different letter in order, starting with whatever the first. And I don't know what the first, Robert, you got any idea what the first letter, what letter A in the Hebrew? I don't know what it is. But in that, if you were reading this and you could read Hebrew, the first letter of that word in the very first verse would be the first Hebrew word in the Hebrew alphabet. Again, it's just a device used to communicate ideas. Lamentation chapter 3 is the same way, except it contains a triple acrostic. The verses are arranged in such a way they repeat the alphabet 3 times. Again, if we were living back in the time of Jeremiah, we read Hebrew, we would understand that. We would see that. So I think that's why it's important for us to understand that's what's going on when we're reading this in our English Bibles. Now, this is what I want to spend the rest of our time on. I think I'm going to have plenty. Um, would y'all be surprised if I ran out of material? Would it be the first time ever that I've run out of material? Well, we'll see. All right, so the third device that I want to, and it's really, in my mind, the most important device used by the writers of this lyric poetry in the Bible is called parallelism. Now, again, there are 6 different kinds of this, and it's not important. You're not going to be able to remember each of these. I realize each of these descriptions, but what's going on, because they're written this way, is what's important. Again, we go back to the scholar I mentioned from the 1700s, Robert Loth, discovered the use of this particular device, especially in the Psalms and other places, but he especially saw it again and again and again in the book of Psalms. Okay. Keep in mind it's about the pattern of ideas rather than the pattern of rhythm and rhyme. By studying and comparing the Psalms, Loth recognized the authors purposely rhymed their ideas, not their words. Interestingly enough, he also found that by the 2nd century AD, right? So, the church was established in 30 AD, and by the end of the 1st century, the New Testament was completed. So, in the 2nd century AD, the Hebrew writers had abandoned this form of writing, this parallelism, but it's very common in the book of Psalms, and we're going to see it repeated again and again. So he determined there were 6 major types of this rhyme of thought, this rhythm of thought that he called parallelism. The first is the most prominent. We see it more than any other of these 6 in the book of Psalms. It's called synonymous parallelism. All right? Now here's what happens in synonymous parallelism. The same thing is said but in different words in successive lines. Okay? So in other words, line 1 and line 2 are parallel, 3 and 4, 5 and 6 so far. Okay, and so on. So look how this works. How blessed are those whose way is blameless, who walk in the law of the Lord. So who is it whose way is blameless? Those who walk in the law. You see how they parallel each other. How blessed are those who observe his testimonies. Who are those people? Who serve him with all their heart. They also do no unrighteousness. Why? Because they walk in his way. You have ordained your precepts that we should keep them diligently. And so I said verses. Each of those lines parallel each other. The 2 lines of verse 1 and 3 and 4 so far. So you can see. Can you see that? The parallel, how those are parallel of thought, but the second line modifies the first line. It just even gives us more information about what God expects. So it's saying the same thing, but in different words in successive lines. Okay, and that's Psalm 119, 1 through 4. The second kind is called antithetic parallelism. I realize you won't remember the description, but when you see these things, maybe you'll remember what this was about. The second line contrasts the first line. So in the first case, the first 2 lines, each pair of lines paralleled each other in thought. In this one, the second line contrasts the line before it. For his anger is but for a moment, his favor for a lifetime. Weeping may last for the night, but a shout of joy comes in the morning. So it's 2 truths that are opposite of each other. Does that make sense? His anger is for a moment, but his favor for a lifetime. The next is called synthetic parallelism. By the way, there will be no tests, I promise. If I have time left, I won't give a test. I promise that. Now, in this one, the second line completes or amplifies the first line. In other words, it gives more information about whatever the first statement is. Then he will speak to them in his anger. But here's what he's going to do. He's going to terrify them in his fury. You know, you get that idea. You know, God is going to speak to them in his anger, but that's not it. He will terrify them with his fury. But as for me, I've installed my king upon Zion, my holy mountain. And terrify them in his fury modifies, or it gives us more information about he will speak to them in his anger. And what does that emphasize? Adding the second line there. What is that? What is the writer, in this case, David, I'm pretty sure. What's David emphasizing here? By giving us the first line of thought and then giving us even more. Yeah, he's not just going to speak, but he's going to terrify. And he's probably talking about, I can go back and read the whole psalm, but I believe he's talking about his enemies. Because often that's what David's writing about, how God has protected him from his enemies. But what's his point in writing using this particular device, do you think? What's he trying to emphasize? God doesn't just say words, but he does what? This is always true. He doesn't just speak words, he also does what? He means what he says and acts on what he says. That we can trust God in his promises when we walk with him, the blessings that will come, but we can also trust that when God says it in his anger, because people are not walking with him, then he's going to follow through. We can trust in that. And we ought, that's a warning, right? David is clearly giving a warning here to those that are against him because they're against God. Okay, I got to get a little bit of teaching in here, y'all. There's a purpose here in David writing those words. Okay, so the fourth is called introverted parallelism. Now, let me tell you, this is just Brother Mazzalonga used this as a device to help you see this. The ABBA doesn't appear in Scripture, but what he wants us to see is this. In this introverted parallelism, the first and last line are similar, and the second and third line are similar. Okay, and they often call this ABBA, because of the pattern. My son, if your heart is wise, my own heart also will be glad, and my inmost being will rejoice when your lip speaks what is right. So think about it. So he's saying, my son, if your heart is wise and your lips speak what is right, my heart will be glad, and my inmost being will rejoice. And so it's introverted. The first line and the last line say virtually the same thing, and the two middle lines do. Again, it's rhythm of thought. Okay. This is a kind of an interesting one, climatic parallelism. Each successive line adds, it's like a stair step, right? And you can even see that in the number of words. The floods have lifted up, O Lord. The floods have lifted up their voice. The floods lift up their pounding waves. And so it's almost like kind of like a crescendo in a song, right? What's the purpose in our psalm books? If you see it in the psalm book, a little P, that means to get soft. And for life of me, Don, can you remember what does that mean? What word is that? Piano. Yeah. And pianissimo, right? That means soft. Oh, double P is pianissimo? That's very soft. So if you see two P's, that means sing very soft. But don't sing too soft, because we sing too soft already. Okay? But if you see an MF, that means mezzo forte, that means get louder. And F is forte, which means, and is there a double forte, Don? I don't know. Yeah? It means like the loudest. We see this in Master, the tempest is raging, right? In the chorus. The winds and the waves shall obey thy will, peace be still. Da 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 da. So why does the writer of the song have the amount of volume go from here to here? What's the purpose? What is he trying to affect? Huh? Emphasis? What were you going to say, Jen? Yeah, the storm, and he's trying to, he's searching for an emotional response for us, right? From us, right? You know, the storm, but there's hope. Get louder and louder and louder, because God's going to save us, right? And so we see a similar thing here. It's not about how loud you're speaking the words, but it's just the emphasis, the impact of the words. The floods have lifted up, O Lord. The floods have lifted up their voice. The floods lift up their pounding waves. It's not just the sound, but it's the waves. And I'm reminded of Jesus on 2 occasions, right? Involved storms, two important miracles, right? The stormy sea. And it wasn't just the floods themselves, but it was the sound of the flood, and it was the pounding waves. So just the emphasis that the writer is trying to get you to. That's what poetry does. It moves you. When David's talking about his love for God, you can just sense in him that he recognizes that he is nothing without God. And then when he's thinking about, he's running away, in almost, I think, case can be made that almost every time we see David talking about his enemies, who's he specifically talking about? Saul, King Saul, who chased him for, I'm convinced, about 20 years, trying to kill David. And so when he's writing about that, you can sense in him. Again, it's not about words that rhyme. It's about just the intensity of the lines. They go up and they go down. And here's a good example of that. And the emotion that it evokes in us as we read it. That's intended by poetry, and specifically in this one. And then the last one that was understood was called emblematic parallelism. And this uses the words like or as. So I guess this would be similar to a simile in English, right? And so he says, as far as the east is from the west. You see the comparison he's making. So as far as the east is from the west, so far has he removed our transgressions from us. So he wants us to understand that God has taken away our transgressions as much as east is from the west. Well, how far is east from the west? Farther than I can imagine, right? That's how far God has taken away our transgressions. Just as the Father has compassion on His children, the Lord has compassion on those who fear Him. So you see the words as and like in this emblematic parallelism. Okay. As we understand these things, they help us better interpret the Psalms because we know who the author is referring to when he speaks. For example, David in Psalm 8 and verse 4 uses synonymous parallelism in describing God's mercy and His caring. Now remember, synonymous is he says it in one line and then he repeats it in the next line. What is man that you take thought of him? And the Son of Man that you care for him. Basically the same thought, right, in both lines. What is man that you take thought of him? What is Son of Man that you care for him? And so we see this synonymous parallelism. David's reference to the Son of Man in the context of the psalm refers to a human being. So we know when he says, what is man, he's talking about a human being. And then he emphasizes that. Then he helps us understand the term Son of Man in the second line also refers to a human being and not God, because these two lines are expressed as synonymous parallelism. So when he says Son of Man, he's still talking about a human being. Now, what human being is he talking about? Who is a man and also the Son of Man? Who is this messianic? Who is this messianic prophecy about? Who's David talking about? Christ, Messiah, right? And we don't have to be left to wonder about that. And in fact, Jesus uses the term Son of Man more than any other way to describe himself in the Gospels. I always found this very fascinating. Nobody else, not the apostles, not his brothers, sisters, not his mother, no one calls Jesus the Son of Man. Only Jesus does. But we don't have to wonder who David's talking about here, do we? All we have to do is go to the book of Hebrews. But one has testified somewhere. Who is that? David, right? This is a very familiar, very well-known psalm of Psalm 8, and particularly this verse. What is man that you remember him? Or the Son of Man that you're concerned about him? David said that. Again, he's still talking about a man. He's not talking about God. He's talking about a man. Now, he's talking about the God-man. There's only been one of those, and that's Jesus. You have made him for a little while lower than the angels. When he sent him to the earth and became a man just like us, you have crowned him with glory and honor and have appointed him over the works of your hand. You have put all things in subjection under his feet. So is there any doubt? Could there be any doubt in the readers of Hebrews who David's talking about? He's clearly talking about Jesus, the Messiah. And so, again, we won't remember that's synonymous parallelism, but understanding that's David's point helps us to understand even what the Hebrew writer is saying here. Okay. So I think we got about a couple of minutes left. Just to kind of summarize, most ancient writings are in poetic form, as is the Old Testament. Again, not all of the Old Testament, but much of it is. And there are these two types of poetry, wisdom and lyric, and we've talked in great detail this morning about lyric poetry. And next week we're going to start looking at, interestingly enough, the type of lyric poetry we're going to look at first is called within Psalms wisdom poetry. Old Testament poetry has its own particular rhythm, no planned rhyme, and uses a variety of devices, and we've looked at those, the assonance, the acrostics, the parallelism. All of these things, we read the Psalms and we don't know that, but maybe having a little bit of information, a little bit knowledge of, oh, I've seen, wait a minute. When you read a Psalm, you may think, hey, look what he's doing here. He's given the same thought over and over again in two lines at a time. You don't have to remember that that's synonymous parallelism, but your brain will say, I've seen that somewhere before. Somebody told me about that. And maybe it will help you to not just read the book of Psalms more deeply than you have before, but maybe the whole Old Testament. And so when you look in the ESV is the same as when you look back in the Old Testament, you'll see a number of these verses. It's more so, I think, in the New American Standard than even in the ESV. But you'll notice that, hey, that's written in poetic form. And so the translators understand this was poetry. And so, again, it helps us to understand a little bit about what the writer is trying to get across to us. Because poetry is to evoke emotion, it's to evoke these deep thoughts about God. In the case of the Psalms, that is. Okay. Is our time about up, Don? Any question? Okay. Well, it says 10:16 up here, so I don't remember what time we ring the bell. Do you? 10:15? Oh, I'm sorry. There y'all are. You and Jason are sitting right in front of me. So it's time to ring the first bell or the second bell? Okay. So technically, I didn't finish on time. Is that what you're telling me, Jeff? Close.